Hello. We've been studying Gideon now for 2 weeks as we looked at chapter 6 and then chapter 7 and 8. And chapter 9, we're going to be in today, is really one of Gideon's children. Not a very good example, I must admit, to follow, a rather ruthless fellow, and his judgment and all will come in chapter 9. It's a long chapter, 57 verses. The context really starts back in chapter 8, verse 29, as we learn that this man, Abimelech, which means my father is king, was from a concubine, not one of the full wives of Gideon, and that apparently he is going to play on his racial identity with the men of Shechem. Now, Shechem is, of course, that very important city. It's where God and Abraham met in Genesis 12, 6 and 7. It's the site where Joseph was buried, Joshua 24:32. It's that site in Joshua 8, verse 30 and 35, where Joshua fulfilled the command of Moses, known as the cursing and blessing section of Deuteronomy 27 and 28. Shechem means the shoulder. It's down in a valley between Mount Gezerim and Mount Ebal. It had some very holy associations back in the patriarchal period. Now, notice what it says. And Abimelech, the son of Zerubbabel, which of course is Gideon, we learn from chapter 6, verse 32. It means Baal will contend or Baal will sue, went to Shechem. Now, we don't know if he was run out by his brothers. Apparently there was some tension between the full brothers, the full sons of Gideon, and then he was the only one that's mentioned from a concubine. Maybe the full sons ran him off. Maybe there was tension between them. We're just not sure. But we're going to see there's some real hatred here. And so he went to his mother's relatives. Now, we learn from history that concubines tend to live with their parents, and their children were uniquely their children, though they inherited some from the father, but not like the full legal children. Shechem may have been his hometown, and we're not sure why he was coming home, or if he just left for a short while. And when it says his mother's relatives, seems to imply that Shechem was a Canaanite city. Now, I want to show you for a minute some of the reasons why I think that it's a Canaanite city. Notice that in verse 3, one of his arguments is that he is one of their relatives. And then down in verse 4, it says they got the money from the house of Baal Berith, which means the Baal of the covenant, Canaanite fertility god. Then down in verse 6, the name, they want to make him king of the city, which is more of a Canaanite deal. Jews don't have kings of cities. Only the Canaanites do, following the Greek city-states. It shows it may be a Canaanite city. And then the oak or the pillar which was in Shechem. And this again, it may be the idea of a diviner's oak, and might show that it was a Canaanite city. Now, this would mean that although Joshua, there's no record of Joshua conquering Shechem. It's just he's there. We're not sure. Maybe he made a deal with some of the Canaanites there, and they lived in that city. We're just not sure. Or the Canaanites recaptured it from the tribal allocation of the Jews. We don't know. But I think it's Canaanites. And that's one reason that they're going to be appealed to by this man. And spoke to them, to the whole clan of the household of his mother's father, saying, Speak now in the hearing of the leaders. Now, this is the word Baali, which is the plural of Baal. It's the ideal of leaders. We see this same kind of definition of leaders. You might want to see Joshua 24:11. Let's see. You might want to see 1 Samuel 23:11, 2 Samuel 21:12 for the use of Baal in its different ways. Which is better for you, that 70 men, all sons of Zerubbabel or Gideon, rule over you, or that one man rule over you? Now, here's the idea of it's better to have one man than all these 70. And also remember that you are bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And then in verse 3, their argument is, well, he is our relative. The implication is he's our relative, and these other 70 men, sons of Gideon, are not our relative. Whether that locks it down, I'm not sure, but it sure gives some good evidence for it. And they gave him 70 pieces. Now, my pieces in my New American Standard Bible are in italics, which means they're not in the Hebrew text. And I want to remind you that probably should be the word shekels. There are no coined money yet. It's weights of money. And this is, they're going to give him some money from this apparently this fertility worship place, Baal Berith, or the Lord of the Covenant. Now in verse 46 of the same chapter, it's going to be El Berith, or God of the Covenant. And so I think it is the fertility god. With which Abimelech, which of course means Melech is king, and you got to add the preposition my father is king. hired worthless and reckless men. Now that he's hiring mercenaries, and this city paid him to do it. And these mercenaries are going to kill Gideon's children. Then he went to his father's house at Orphah, which is about 30 miles from Shechem. You might want to see chapter 6, verse 11. That's where the angel of the Lord met Gideon in the wine press right at the beginning of this account. And killed his brothers, the sons of Zerubbabel, 70 men on one stone. Now, there's some strange deal here about the one stone. Why would he kill all these brothers at one stone? There's almost a sacrificial implication here. The Hebrew mind, blood, was a very significant thing. And the blood of slain people kind of polluted the ground. And the idea of the blood was all put in this one place on a stone is like they're almost being killed on an altar. But that's reading more than's really here, but it is strange he killed them all on one stone. But notice that one son named Jotham, which means Yahweh is perfection, the youngest was left, and he hid himself and got away. And all the men of Shechem and all the men of Beth Milo. Now, the word Beth in Hebrew means house, like Bethlehem. Beth is house, and Milo seems to be filled dirt, some kind of earthwork. We learned this in several times from the life of David in Jerusalem and several others. You might want to check 2 Samuel 5:9 and 2 Kings 12:20. I really believe this Beth Milo was a tower a little bit removed from the city, kind of like we learned last week. The Tower of Penuel was a little outside the city. And I believe this Beth Milo is probably synonymous with the Tower of Shechem mentioned in 9:46. And we'll see that later. And they made Abimelech king. That's unusual because he's king only of one city, and that's not a Hebrew way, that's a Greek way or a Canaanite way. By the oak of the pillar which is at Shechem. And, of course, we see this may be the oak referred to in Genesis 35:4, Joshua 34:26, or it may just be a high place of Baal worship. And if it is that high place, the oak of the pillar, and, of course, a raised pillar was the symbol of Baal. If it is just another high place, it's a reference to the fact that this city was a Canaanite city and not a Jewish city. Now, when they told Jotham, he went and stood on the top of Mount Gezerim. Now, remember, that's one of those mountains of the covenant back in Deuteronomy 27 and 28 that's fulfilled in Joshua chapter 8. So he's up on the city speaking down. Many times topological formations form a normal amphitheater. And him on top of a mountain speaking down, I read a commentary that said a man tried to do that and could be heard several miles from the top of that mountain, so I think that fits. And he lifted up his voice and called out. Now he's going to give a parable about what these men of Shechem have done. It runs from verse 7 to verse 21. And basically it's a parable about trees. And let me read a little bit of it. Once the trees went forth to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my fatness, which the God and men are honored, and go and wave over trees? And the tree said to the fig tree, you come reign over us. And the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit, and go to wave over the trees? And the tree said to the vine, you come reign over us. And the vine said to them, shall I leave my new wine, which cheers God and men, and go and wave over you? And just an aside here, how does wine cheer God? Well, back in Numbers chapter 15, verses 7 and 10, wine is, and I think in the book of Leviticus too, wine is one of the implements that are in the sacrifices that are poured out on the altar. And the sweet aroma of the wine went up to God is the allusion here of how it gladdens the heart of God. And then wine gladdens men? Yes. Matter of fact, Psalms 104, verses 14 and 15 said, wine is a gift from God that gladdens the hearts of men. And you can see both those references. And finally, all the trees said to the bramble, come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in truth you are anointing me as king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. Well now, brambles don't have any shade. They're a ground vine. The implication here is brambles can provide about as much shade to a tree as Abimelech is going to be able to offer help and comfort to Shechem. That's the analogy. May fire come out from the bramble and consume the cedars of Lebanon. Now, the dangerous thing about vines is that they're very flammable. They burn very hot, and when the brambles catch on fire, the whole forest goes up with it. And that seems to be the implication here. Verses 16 through 21, this young man says, "You haven't acted fair with my family, my father. My father delivered you, but you haven't acted fair with him. You haven't acted fair with his sons. You've killed them. You've made Abimelech your king, and may God judge you for that." And God's going to. And verse 22. "Now Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years." Now this is a kind of a limited way of saying that. He didn't really rule over Israel. He ruled over one city and the surrounding area. And so I think to say he's one of the judges of Israel is a bit much. I just don't think he really is. "And God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem." Oh my, what are we going to do with that? God sent an evil spirit? I didn't know God dealt with evil spirits. Yes, he does, in this sense. Now listen to me. I want you to think Old Testament, not think New Testament. The Bible asserts there is one and only one God, and therefore everything that happens comes from that one source because there's only one true God. So in the older parts of the Old Testament, calamity and blessing come from the same source because there's only one source. Let me give you a few references you might want to look up. You might want to look up Ecclesiastes 7:14. You might want to look up Isaiah 45:7 and Isaiah 54:16. You might want to look up Lamentations 3:38. You might want to look up Amos chapter 3 verse 6. And to some extent, all of Ezekiel 14 has this emphasis. Now, that's that God sends an evil spirit. Now, what about the evil spirit himself? We see this evil spirit in the life of Saul quite readily. If you want to look at 1 Samuel 16, verse 14, and 1 Samuel 18, verse 10, and 1 Samuel 19:9, that God sends an evil spirit to Saul. Matter of fact, another allusion to an evil spirit being used by God is in 1 Kings 22:19 through 23. I don't have all the answers here. I think it's saying that God caused trouble between these people, and that fits the context. And the idea of an evil spirit is something we have to struggle with. But remember that God also is in charge of the death angel. It's not a grim reaper, it's an angel that does God's bidding. And when we see that, it kind of makes it a little easier. "And the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech." Now, how did they do that? Well, I'm down in verse 25. And notice it's going to say that either they're going to try to ambush Abimelech or they're going to try to ambush all these caravans that he's taxing and take the taxation money for he gets it. And I'm not sure which it is, but let's do 24 first. "And all the violence done to the 70 sons of Abimelech might come, and their blood might be laid on Abimelech." Now, their blood is going back to Cain and Abel. Remember where Abel's blood cried from the ground? This innocent blood cried out for vengeance, and that's what these 70 sons of Gideon are. Their blood's crying out. This innocent blood. You might want to see a couple of references, maybe. Numbers 35:33. Genesis 4:10 is, of course, Abel's blood. And then 2 Samuel 3:28 and 29 is some references to blood crying out. "And on the men of Shechem who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers." They were duplicitous in this, and they were as responsible as Abimelech for doing it. Now, in verse 25, notice it says that to set up an ambush against him. Seems to imply they were out to kill Abimelech. But then it keeps going. It says they robbed all who might pass by. That seems to imply they were robbing the caravan or the travelers that went by to take the revenue away from Abimelech or cause bad blood between the travelers. We're not sure exactly what's happening here. Verse 26. "Now Gaal, the son of Ebed, came with his relatives and crossed over into Shechem, and the men of Shechem put their trust in him." Well, this shows how fickle these guys were. First they go to Abimelech, then they go to Gaal. Now this Gaal had a festival, a party in verse 27, and they all drank and got crocked and made all kind of weird statements. And in verse 28, they cursed Abimelech after they got drunk, you know. They went to the house of their god, which I would think would be the Baal, the fertility god. Now, who is Abimelech and who is Shechem that we should serve him? Now, that sounds funny at first, but if you look at the other Hebrews, this is just a way of saying Abimelech from Shechem. And you might want to see that same thing about David, where that parallel Hebrew phrase is used in 1 Samuel 25:10 and 1 Kings 12:16. Now, what this guy is basically advocating is going back to the old days, the old ways, the old gods. we don't need Abimelech. We go back to the old ways, and apparently fertility worship. We get this when he mentions and serve the men of Hamor. The word Hamor means a donkey. And if we go back in Genesis 33:19 and Genesis 34:6, we find that this was the original inhabitants of Shechem, was the descendants of Hamor. And so this guy is advocating a return to the old tribal ways. Now there was a leader of the city there. I like verse 29. He said to Abimelech, "Increase your army and come out." Now, isn't that just like a bunch of drunks? They're talking through their hat. They're talking to Abimelech, but the problem is Abimelech's not there and he can't hear them. And they have a lot of real bravery here in their drinking. But unfortunately, this prophecy is going to come true. Notice it says that Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gael, the son of Ebed, and his anger burned. Well, why? Well, probably because he's going to lose his job, right? If the city fell and he was one of the administrators of Abimelech, he might lose his job. So he sent messengers. Now, the word deceitfully here can mean in code or secretly got the message out of the city, because apparently Abimelech didn't live in Shechem. We learned from verse 41 that he lived in Arumah. And he got the message to him and told him, "You better come. This man's stirring up trouble." And so Abimelech is going to come. And this man, Zebul, is going to tell him, "Now you wait outside and wait for him and trap him when he comes outside." And gives him a whole war plan. And Abimelech follows suit. So next day, this man comes out, and Gael and Zebul are standing there. And Gael says, "Don't I see some men coming off the hill up there?" And Zebul says, "Nah, it's just too early in the morning. You just can't see good." And waited a few minutes, and Gael says, "I do see men." And Zebul says, "You bet your bippy. It's Abimelech who you wanted to fight. And now here he is. Go out and do it." Well, Gael was trapped then. In verse 37, something's interesting where it says the highest part of the land is where the people were coming from, apparently down from one of the mountains, Ebal or Gezerim. This is the word navel in Hebrew. Now, navel in the Canaanite idolatry, the Canaanite mythology, navel was the connecting place in the earth where heaven and earth met, kind of a channel between them. And so you see, this is not a Hebrew theology, it's Canaanite theology. And I think this city is a Canaanite city. And they came by way of the diviner's oak, which was probably the oak of Moreh, that kind of thing. Well, the people, Gael was defeated and all his relatives, but notice in verse 42, the next day, some other men of the city came out, and Abimelech springs a trap on them. Apparently, he is so angry with what the men of Shechem did. Apparently, the whole city kind of plotted against him. So the men came out to work in the fields, and he sprung a trap on them and closed off their escape back into the walled city and killed all of them. And then he sowed the city with salt. Now, notice this in verse 45. This is a curse symbol, which means sown it with salt means nothing will grow there, symbol of a curse. Or it's a way of cleansing something. Now, what it is, I'm not sure, because he's going to kill all the men of Shechem, or at least the rebels who are in with Gael. Now, these rebels heard about what happened, and they ran and hid themselves in the tower of Shechem. Look at verse 46. Apparently, it was separate from the city. And Abimelech went up into the mountain. You see it in verse 47, Mount Zalmon. I don't know where that is. And he cut down a tree and told his army to cut down a tree. And they piled wood next to this tower, and they burned it, and the smoke and fire killed everybody who was in there. And so here we have Abimelech taking vengeance on Shechem, right? And that's part of the prophecy that God would judge the people of Shechem. And then what we're going to have in the latter part of this is that God's going to judge Abimelech. He did win the battle of Shechem. He did destroy Shechem. And then for some reason he went out in verse 50 to Thebes. Now this is another city kind of close. We think it's about 10 miles northeast of Shechem. And he tried to capture it. Maybe he needed a new city. The city he had, he apparently destroyed with fire. And he wanted a new place to rule. And maybe that's why he went to this city. The city, the men of the city went into a strong tower in the center of the city, kind of like the PL and Shechem. But this tower was right in the middle of the city instead of far removed. And Abimelech and his army came up around this tower, and an old woman apparently threw down an upper millstone. Now, an upper millstone is about 2 or 3 inches thick and about 18 inches in diameter. And it's used to grind corn. And she threw that off the top of this and hit Abimelech in the head and crushed his skull. And look at this in verse 54. And he quickly called to the young man, his armor-bearer, and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest it be said of me, a woman slew me." So the young man pierced him through. He's about to die, and he's worried about his reputation. Now, isn't that stupid? So here we have that God fulfilled the parable of Jotham about how Abimelech had treacherously killed his brothers. And the hate between Shechem and Abimelech got so strong that Abimelech destroyed Shechem, and then Abimelech was destroyed. And that kind of fulfilled the prophecy of judgment because of his inappropriate acts in killing his brothers, and Shechem's inappropriate acts in hiring the men to do that. And that's what it says, "And God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father in killing his 70 brothers. Also God returned all the wickedness of the men of Shechem on their heads, and the curse of Jotham, the son of Zerubbabel, came upon them." Now, what do you think this chapter says for us? Well, I think it says that your sins will find you out, right? We have many people here who are a strange mixture of doubt and faith, like Gideon. But Abimelech is just a vicious man. He just takes advantage of people, and God judges him for him shedding innocent blood. And I think we see that throughout this. It also shows that the duplicitous relationship of Shechem in this made them also guilty. I think when we participate in evil, that there's a collective sense in evil. It's hard for us in America to realize that, but not only is there an evil that is individual that we'll give account for, but I think there's an evil as we participate in our society that we will give an account for. And this somehow shows you that Shechem as a whole is judged, even though it's only the leaders that participate. The whole city is destroyed. And this, again, is this corporate idea that we saw first in the book of Joshua. Well, we see it first really in the fall of Adam and Eve, and all men are affected. And then we see it very clearly in the early parts of Joshua, the destruction of Jericho, where part of the clothing and metal was taken, and Achan's sin affected the Israeli army, and they lost the battle the next day at Ai, and then Achan and all his family were stoned. Well, again, that's that corporate sense, and we must remember that in the Old Testament. Well, I think this deal about the evil spirit from the Lord is probably one of the most interesting aspects of this chapter. I think it'd be very good for you to get your concordance out and look up the evil spirit of the Lord, run those references, and recognize that it is only the idea of one causality, and that God is the force behind all things, and whether it's calamity or good, He is behind it. Matter of fact, I think I might just go ahead and read Isaiah 45:7, for I think it sums up this in such a beautiful way. Notice where it says, "The one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all these." And another one I think that's just striking in what it says is Amos chapter 6. We find Amos 6, verse 3. Listen to this one. Let's see here. Amos 3:6, excuse me. "If the trumpet is blown in a city, will not the people tremble? If a calamity occurs in a city, has not the Lord done it?" And here again we see that calamity is attributed to God. And that's somewhat difficult for us to understand. And let me give you one more, and that's in the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 4. Listen to this. Verse 14. "In the day of prosperity be happy, but in the day of adversity consider. Has God not made one as well as the other?" Well, that's, again, that one source of all things. Well, I hope you'll think about this, and that'll be a very important point you want to talk about. I've enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.